So here's the title, Can a Machine Be Conscious? It's very nice to see all of you. I used to teach a freshman course with about this many people, and so I love it. Okay. So let me make the point, maybe before this, is that this is really joint work with Lenore Blum. And we really, the ideas you hear, she could be up here giving them just as I am. It really is joint work. So I want to talk about consciousness. So let me start by at least making sure that we're all thinking about the same thing. And so what I mean by consciousness, what we mean by consciousness, is conscious awareness. Everything you are aware of while you are awake or dreaming, and also what you see, what you hear, what you feel, and most especially your own private inner speech, because you all speak to yourself a lot of the time in your head. And this is all, that's what we are conscious of. So here are some examples of conscious and unconscious experiences. Have you had the experience of going to a party and you see someone whose name you know or should know, but it doesn't come to you? And maybe in a while, maybe you'll come to you, oh, it begins with W. And then half an hour later, that's Walter. Have you had that experience? And you wonder, where did that come from? You see, your unconscious, which is most of your brain, has been working on this problem. You want to know the person's name. And half an hour later, it has been able to come up with that name. So that's an experience we have. There are several other things I could talk about here. Selective attention, learning to play ping pong. So, you know, if you want to learn to play ping pong, it's important to actually pay attention and think about what you're doing. But the ping pong players tell us that when you're in a tournament, take the conscious mind out of it. Do it unconsciously. And it's an example of this conscious-unconscious thinking. So the question I have is, can a machine be conscious? And we, Lenore and I, really do believe that it's possible to build a machine that experiences consciousness. And what I'd like to do today is give you a model of a model of what we call the conscious Turing machine. And we find that this model is based on what the neuroscientists have told us is a good model of what's going on in the brain. And it's a very interesting model. The architecture that the neuroscientists come up with is completely different from the architecture that we're using in our computers. And so we are trying to, what we are doing is we hear what the neuroscientists tell us, and we are trying to now make a model, a mathematical model, a simple mathematical model based on what the neuroscientists tell us. Just like Turing tried to make design a Turing machine, very simple kind of computer to mirror what's possible with a computer. The hope here with the conscious Turing machine is to be able to explain consciousness. And besides consciousness, we'll check on how good this model is by looking at how it explains such notions as free will, and how pain and joy are generated by the body. When I was a kid, I just could not understand how the body can generate pain. I knew that I would be able to build a machine, a robot that can simulate the feeling of pain, but I had no idea how to make it actually feel the pain. Now, I tell people that this model is intended to help you understand how it can feel the pain or feel the joy, and most people just say, you're crazy, and that's not possible. So let's see if I can convince you otherwise. The point is that the machine is to really experience these qualia, the ache of pain, the joy, ecstasy of joy, not just simulate the experience. Okay, so where are we? So one measure of success would be whether, so measures of success, we'll come back to that. So the main point is that our view of consciousness is that you do not have to be made out of flesh and blood to experience these aches and pains and joys. That this can be done with silicon and metal, and therefore with computers. And the contention is that the architecture of these systems is what makes them conscious. Okay, so how is computer science theory relevant? So you have to understand I'm a theoretical computer scientist. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know about that. I know about mathematics and logic, and I would like to, how can I, as a computer scientist, possibly do anything useful? How can we do anything useful? Well, we do it by creating a model, a precise formal model, and then we prove theorems. And if the theorems seem right and the results seem correct, then that sort of shows that the model is likely to be okay. And if not, then we have to change the model. Okay, so let's keep on going. So conscious Turing machine. And so what follows, we'll define the conscious Turing machine and then define consciousness in that machine. Okay? So I want to make clear that we are distinguishing human consciousness, your consciousness, from robot consciousness. See, robot consciousness is brown, and human consciousness is black. They're distinct. All I can do is talk to you about robot consciousness, because we'll define the machine and then talk about consciousness, and that's the robot. And the hope is that this is very close to and helps you to understand even human consciousness. So, okay, so the conscious Turing machine. So another point, the conscious Turing machine is at best a gross simplification of a real brain. It turns out that in this model there's long-term memory and short-term memory, and when I've given these talks, the psychologists have come to me and said, well, you know, there are many memories. There's not just long-term and short-term. And I remember one professor of psychology saying that, and the graduate student telling her, he's not trying to get a model of the brain, he's just trying to get the simplest model. And I thought that was great, because this is a simplification. It's related to a real brain somewhat the way a Turing machine is related to a computer. We're not trying to get an exact model, we're trying to get an understanding of consciousness. Okay? There are a lot of wonderful neuroscientists at work on this. All of this work was done after 1989, really. In 1989, Bernard Bars, who's first on this list because he begins with B, but also first to actually do this, came up with a wonderful model, this model that explained to me how it's possible for a machine to be able to feel and be conscious. And let me just say that this model is something I had been looking for all my life. I really wanted to have some understanding, some kind of a model. When I learned about finite automata, I thought, that's a model, but it's not quite right. And then when I learned about Turing machines, that's a model, but that's not quite right. The intent here is to get a real model. So there's Bernie Bars and his book, which is wonderful reading. And this is his model. So I'm going to, very informally, his model of consciousness is that it's like this. There's someone or very few people on the stage, and you're paying attention to that person. See, you, the audience, are the unconscious processors in this brain, and I'm the conscious part. And what goes on here is the conscious part thinks, maybe has a question, what's that person's name? And it will take a while. The unconscious processors see the question. That's the audience member. Each one has his own or her own responsibility. There's an unconscious processor that's responsible for faces, for detecting faces, another one for naming faces. There are unconscious processors for many different things. You don't know where in your brain that name is stored. But maybe one of these unconscious processors will come up and say, oh, that name begins with W. And then that's everything when I get that it begins with W, then that information is broadcast to you, to the unconscious processors. You then know that it begins with W, and another one of you processors might realize, oh, the name is Walter, and that's what you're getting half an hour later. Okay, so this model, is that okay? Is this, the one difficult thing with a very big audience is very hard for me to tell. Okay, so Lenore says, keep going. Okay, so here is Bernie Barr's model. This is a nice informal model. He's trying already to make a formal model. Let me now go on to give you our formal model. So you understand, I'm giving you now our formal model, the conscious Turing machine. And this model has, in yellow is the part that we're conscious of. It's a very small amount of stuff that we're conscious of. There's this short-term memory or working memory, which is known to have very little information. George Miller said that working memory can store 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. Never said what a chunk was, but he did give some examples. A chunk is like a digit or a letter or a word. It can even be a poem if you've learned it. That's what a chunk is. He gave only examples. One of the things that comes out of this model is what a chunk is. I will give you a definition for a chunk. And then there's the whole question, why so few? Computer scientists say, why are we conscious just of a few things? You know, you can remember a 7-digit phone number. Somebody gives you a 7-digit phone number, you can go over and find a piece of paper and write it down. But if they give you 10 digits, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be in trouble. It's amazing how hard it is. Here it is, that short-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2 chunks, and then there's the input. You're conscious of a lot of what you see. You're actually only conscious of a small fraction of what you see. Okay, so here's what it is. You saw this picture. This is an upside-down house. It's actually a real house. It's in Moscow. There are a number of upside-down houses in the world. This one's a great tourist attraction. It's about 6 years old, and it's wonderful to go up it and to go inside, and you see that everything's glued to the ceiling. The beds, the chairs, it's a wonderful upside-down house. So you saw this before. Your sense is that you see the whole house. What you actually see is only what you pay attention to. So if you imagine putting it away, or one of the best ways to tell what we actually see is if you see it in a dream, that's about as much as you see. Or if you close your eyes, you don't even see that much. Here's short-term memory. Short-term memory, this happens to be you at some point in your life when you wanted to see if you can turn the lights off by thinking about it. Have you had that experience? Can you turn off the light just by thinking it? Or you've seen maybe Yoda over here. He can do these amazing things. He can lift a rock into, just think it, lift a rock. Have you tried to do that? So kids will definitely try to do that because you don't know. Thank you, Daniela. You don't know what you can do until you try. Do you know if you can wiggle your ears? Can you wiggle your ears? You know, you can try, and then you only know if you look in the mirror or try to feel it, whether you succeeded or not. And the same thing is true here. You can try to lift that rock, right? You can basically send the instructions to the output to lift the rock. And whether or not you succeeded, that you can only tell by looking. You cannot tell otherwise, okay? So what we are conscious of is what's just in that short-term memory, a little bit of what we see, not all of what we see, and only of the fact that we are sending signals to the output. Here's the model. So you've got this short-term memory, and you've got lots of processors down at the bottom. See, there's a processor for faces. In the brain, it has a name. It's called the fusiform face area. So there's a part of the brain that's especially dedicated to faces. There are parts of the brain dedicated to speech. You know, there's Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and there are many other areas dedicated to speech. There is fine control, which you get from the cerebellum. There is a part of the brain that's called the amygdala, and it's concerned with fear. So there are many different, see, you are all specialists. You are my long-term memory. You are the specialists, and you each have different knowledge and different interests. See, this is just the same picture, but showing you more of this, more of these processors, and this keeps on going. This slide and the next slide are the base, are the real meat of this talk. Here is a tree, and everything that you are conscious of, everything in that very small short-term memory is broadcast to the entire audience. And you see here, it's being broadcast down to the entire audience. I have the broadcast in this model as being a broadcast to a binary tree. It could be n-ary tree, it could be, the constant doesn't matter. Even 2 is fine, because you know you can, with depth log n, you can get to n processors. So a very small depth is enough to be able to get to all that information out there. This is fast. But then there's the information coming back. And that has to be slow, because each of you, and I'm trying to think of what that name is, some of you have some information and others have different information, and you will have to work that information up to the top. And occasionally one has to decide which information should go up, because the memory up there is very small. Only some of it can go up. And so the work going up is slow. And this is an example of how it's done. We have, in this case, something like pain. Pain has a weight associated with it. You know that pain is, there are these nerve fibers called nociceptors that are responsible for telling you about pain. If you hurt yourself, there are nerve fibers that send the signal to the brain, and they say, well, I've got a pain in the wrist, and according to how strong the signal is, how high the frequency, there's a weight associated with that pain. That's the weight that this pain is going up with. And it's negative here because pain is something you don't want, and joy is something you do want. And so these pain and joy can meet. And what happens now is that when they meet, the one with the higher magnitude, in this case it's 5, has greater magnitude than 3, that goes up, and it goes up with the sum. In this model, it goes up with the sum. Now, and it can keep on going. Now pain meets fear, pain is -2, fear is -5. The one with the higher magnitude, that's the fear, goes up, and it goes up with the sum. Okay, so that's how the information gets up to the top. One of the things that comes out of this model is the suggestion that if you have strong pain, but you have an equally strong joy, then they should subtract. This is what this is saying, is that they should cancel each other. And so it's interesting to ask. You see, you can ask, does this actually happen? Does joy subtract pain? And so it's interesting to see that in the dentist's office, have you ever had laughing gas? When you they're working on a tooth, it's a great stuff to have. Laughing gas can make you feel really nice, I can tell you. And the dentist is told, you give just enough laughing gas to cancel the pain. Not too little and you'll feel pain, too much and you get manic. And so there's a sense that these do actually cancel each other. And of course, the final result at the top says basically where you're at. You see, what happens is by the time you get to the top, at the very top, the integer that's at the top actually will tell you whether you're more negative or more positive, because it's the sum of all of the weights at the bottom. You do this. This is part of what's coming out of this model. A few more things. There are these permanent one-way connections from the input to some processors. They don't even have to go through consciousness. What's a good example where you don't even have to be conscious of. I'm trying to think of an example where something goes on. I had examples. Oh, sorry. There are reasons to believe that this input has direct input also to the long-term memory, and that some of those long-term processors can have direct output, direct connections to the output. The model consists of just that. This is the summary slide. This shows you the entire model, going down, going up, and these connections. One thing about this model is you might think that these processors would talk to each other down here. In this model, if one of those processors says the name begins with W, but doesn't, and that information goes up, you get conscious of it, it's broadcast, and then another processor can take over and say, the name is Walter. So here, we don't have any direct connections with the processors, and we're not sure whether that's the right thing for the model, but we are trying to keep the model as simple as possible. So this is how it's working. Okay, no central executive. This is the thing that the neuroscientists and the psychologists, and well, most everybody thinks that there must be a central executive to decide what goes on the stage, but we're saying no, that function can be taken over by the processors, the long-term memory processors themselves. Okay, and we really thought about that. I think that that's probably correct. So no central executive. This is something you might question. That's fine. The central executive function performed by the unconscious processors. Each unconscious processor receives whatever is broadcast from the stage. Let's see, this keeps on going. I'm having trouble with this thing. I'm not sure just how far to go with this. There are details here that I won't get into. Some of the details here, like how those weights are determined. I told you for pain, but these details are needed. Nagging processor. For example, have you ever had the experience that there's something you're supposed to do, and you do, but you don't do it because the fun things to do, and the next day begins to bother you, and then after a while it bothers you more and more. You see, there's a processor there that's concerned with nagging you, and the longer you don't do it, the higher its weight, until finally it gets up there and doesn't let you do something else. Okay. Details. There's the 7 plus or minus 2 that I had mentioned to you. And here's a definition of chunk. The idea is that when a processor has an address, a location, it has some information that it wants to send up to the consciousness. It has a certain weight, which says how important that is. And our definition of a chunk is that triple: the address, the information, the weight. That's the triple. What we actually are conscious of is probably just that information. We don't really know where it's located, and we only have a rough idea of how important it is. But in this definition of a formal Turing machine, conscious Turing machine, that triple is a chunk. Chunks are, this is definition of chunks. This is an example where a chunk is a chunk that's often on the stage is context. You kind of know, I'm here in front of you people talking, and that's the context. When you're driving a car, a chunk may be on the stage is focusing attention on a particular task, such as driving a car. And yet another chunk may focus on a task such as texting. You know, that's a bad idea. Driving a car, texting, you know how that is. So, okay. Let me give you an example of how this works. So I'm going to tell you a story by the wonderful writer Oliver Sacks. I don't know if you have, he died recently, but he's a terrific psychologist and physician, and he writes these wonderful books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and Walter's saying yes, so that's good. And so here's a story that may be very relevant here. Oliver Sacks likes to hike. He was hiking in the Swiss mountains. He liked hiking. He saw, I've been in the Swiss Alps. I see cows way up there. It's just amazing. And he was up there hiking, and he saw a fence, and he saw a sign. The sign said, "Beware the bull." Look, no bull. So he walked into the field, and he was enjoying his walk, walked in, and then suddenly he saw the bull. The bull was down on the ground, and when the bull saw him, he saw the bull starting to get up on its haunches. And it scared the living daylights out of him. And so he turned around and ran as fast as he could out of that field. And he didn't notice until after he was out of that field that he had torn, severely torn, ligaments in his leg. In fact, it took him a month later in the hospital to get back to health. And if you've ever torn a ligament, you know that that's one of the most painful things you can imagine. It's a really agonizing thing to do. He did not notice until after he was out of the field. So, let's see, so I guess I don't have this here. So the description is like this. He sees the bull, he's frightened, fear suddenly gets a very high weight and works its way up. That's at the top. And once it's up there with a very high weight, nothing else can get up there. Nothing else, the pain, whatever it is, cannot get up there until the fear subsides enough for the pain to get up there, and then he notices the pain. Okay, so there's that story. So what accounts for consciousness? We're saying it's the architecture and the dynamics. That architecture that I showed you and the dynamics of broadcast from the short-term memory down to from working memory down to long-term memory, down to the audience, and then the slow, relatively slow information going back. Okay, so so now let me define robot consciousness for you. So definition, the contents of that short-term memory, including whatever input-output is being paid attention to, that's what you are conscious of. That is consciousness? And we're suggesting yes. Why is this a reasonable definition? So we're simply saying whatever is in that short-term memory, that is what you are conscious of. Does this explain anything? Like why it would be conscious? So the point of the explanation is that what's in that short-term memory is being broadcast to every processor in your brain. If any processor were responsible for consciousness, it would know what's up there in short-term memory. And the point is that every processor sees that. This will be important. It's our reason for saying that this is reasonable definition. So, okay, so which of these long-term memory processors do we deem necessary for robot consciousness? So this is kind of interesting. You know, different people have slightly different definitions of consciousness. We say that there are basically three things that are important for consciousness. The three things are, you must be self-aware. You must have a model of yourself in your head. Self-awareness. You must have inner speech. You must be able to do planning. The inner speech is really for planning. My dog, I'm sure, is conscious, and its inner speech is more doggish. I speak English, you speak German. We each have our language. I'm sure a dog also has its language, its way of planning what it wants to do. And finally, there's motivation. Desire, energy, that I call motivation. This has to be, this we could say is necessary for consciousness. We've tried to see if anything else is necessary, and we've had a lot of trouble doing that. I haven't really defined these all, but let me just give you an example having to do with motivation. We say you must have this desire and energy, for example, to eat, to have food. And so here's an interesting thing. There are some human beings who have lost the motivation to see the left side of their field of vision. It's called left hemispatial neglect. And you take a person like this, they can see what's in the left side, but they're simply not conscious of it, really. They're not motivated to look at it. They're not motivated to take it into account. Here you see a drawing on the left, and on the right, the drawing by a patient with left hemispatial neglect. It's interesting, these people. You can put a plate of food in front of them, and they will eat the stuff on the right, and if they're still hungry, they don't know that there's food there. You have to come in, take the plate, and turn it around, and then they can eat. It's interesting. So you can ask yourself, why don't they turn the plate around? And the point is, they are not conscious of the fact that they're not seeing it. They are simply totally unconscious of it. So here are some other reasons that might explain consciousness. You might think that there are lots of long-term memory processors. Which ones are really necessary? Which ones are important? And here's a list of possibilities. And each of these possibilities, there's an example of a person that's conscious and yet doesn't have that particular ability. There's a woman named SM whose amygdala is calcified, and because of that, the amygdala is responsible for fear. She has no fear. Wouldn't you like that? No fear of anything. Saying you're right. It's just maybe not. She was in a park at night. Somebody came to her with a knife. She wasn't afraid at all. It's amazing that she survived. She knows to be careful crossing the street, even though she's not afraid of those cars. And so she has somehow survived without it. But you can sort of see why having fear could be a very good thing. There is a person named Caleb who has never experienced love. He's married. He has kids. But yeah, he simply doesn't know anything about love. Each of these embarrassment, guilt, anger, hate, pain, fine motor control. The cerebellum is responsible for fine motor control. Half of your neurons are in your cerebellum. Half of your brain is in your cerebellum. And yet there are people that are born without a cerebellum, and these people are conscious. They have a harder time walking. They learn to walk by age 7, but they learn to walk. They never learn to ride a bicycle because that's just too hard without a cerebellum, but they are conscious. So each of these are things which you don't have to have in order to be conscious. Okay, so now I'd like to, it's 6:30 already. Okay, so I'd like to explain some of the ways that the model could achieve free will, pain, joy, motivation. The model has to be able to explain these. If it's a good model, it should be able to help me understand these. There's maybe enough time, let's see what I can do. Free will. So the model really is very nice, gives a very nice explanation of free will. But I ask you, please, if you don't find this satisfying, you should let me know. So the paradox of free will. This is an amazing statement. This is 2 centuries ago. You see this Lucretius writing something which is just amazing to me, because he didn't know about Newton and Newton's laws. If all movement is always interconnected, the new arising from the old in a determinate order, if the atoms never swerve so as to originate some new movement that will snap the bonds of fate, the everlasting sequence of cause and effect, what is the source of the free will possessed by living things throughout the earth? You wondered about that? I mean, it's kind of interesting. First of all, that he had this notion that, you know, no spirits involved. Everything is physics. Here's Samuel Johnson. He lived just after Newton, and his age coincided with Newton. His years coincided in part with Newton. And so he knew about Newton's wonderful theory, and he was great at these very short, simple statements. Here's something he said, all about free will. All theory is against the freedom of the will. Basically, Newton's laws tell you there is no free will. Everything's determined. What the hell? There is no free will. All theory is against the freedom of the will. All experience is for it. You know you have free will. How does one explain this? There's Newton. You see he's overlapping Samuel Johnson. And you know, a little later, here's Laplace saying that from the position and velocity of all the atoms in the universe, the future is completely determined. So where's the free will coming from? So here's the explanation. So I love this explanation because we came up with this explanation, and then here is Dan Dehaney saying exactly the same thing, even better. He says, our brain states are clearly not uncaused and do not escape the laws of physics. Nothing does. But our decisions are genuinely free whenever they are based on a conscious deliberation that proceeds autonomously without any impediment. Carefully weighing the pros and cons before committing to a course of action. When this occurs, we are correct in speaking of a voluntary decision, even if it is, of course, ultimately caused by our genes. The way we had explained it was, you're playing a game of chess. You play chess, you know, and normally you're there and you have several possible moves you can make, and you think about which ones, and often it comes down to, should I move this piece here or that piece there? And you have free will. Free will in the sense that you do not make up your mind until you have come to some conclusion, until you figure it out which is the better move or the clock runs out. And until then, you have free will. You are free to choose whichever you compute to be better. So, this is definitions of free will. Our definition, free will is the ability to compute the consequences of different courses of action and choose accordingly. So there's chess, free will. This notion of free will doesn't, notice that no randomness is required. You might think that randomness is important. No, it's, why did the ancients have such difficulty with free will? So our answer is they didn't know about computational complexity. They did not know that it takes effort and time to actually do a computation. And while you're doing that computation, trying to figure out what to do, you see yourself as being free to choose whichever. So computation cannot be done in an instance. Not even a supercomputer can do it in an instance. Let's see, this is a good point. Any questions here? Yes? That's right. The computer, absolutely. The computer, you know, playing the game of chess, while it has to make that move, before it's made the move, has to actually do. The question is, I guess, how is it? Does the computer have free will? It doesn't. Does it have free will? So, by this definition, it has free will because until it has actually computed what it will do, it is free to choose whatever will result. Okay, so that's free will. Now, let me try to explain some of these emotions that we have. So now this gets touchy. For you to accept the arguments, for me to be able to convince you, for us to be able to convince you, we need you to accept that, first of all, consciousness has a physical explanation. Not everyone believes that, right? I mean, there are plenty of people who think that there's something spiritual that's required. Our point is it's completely physical, absolutely completely physical, and that something like the conscious Turing machine is a credible model for consciousness. Maybe this will be a good model, maybe not, but something like that. There is an explanation for such things as the ecstasy of joy. So now I would like to explain how the conscious Turing machine generates robot consciousness and emotions with properties somewhat like human consciousness and emotions. So one point I want to make here is that so many of the explanations I get have to do with the chemicals. You know, you hear about acetylcholine, dopamine, endorphin, GABA, glutamate. These are all wonderful. These are what the neuroscientists are finding either help us to understand pain or pleasure. But you know, these are not going to be in a robot. A robot will not have any of this. I don't accept these as an explanation for how those emotions come about. So, what we have found is that each of these emotions has to be considered separately and independently, and I'm going to start with physical pain. Physical pain in part because it's a tangible qualia. We all know what it's like to feel pain. We have all hit our thumb with a hammer and we know what pain is. Yes, he's going, right, we know what pain is. So that's good because I would like to start with that one. But I guess people also want to know, why would you want a machine to feel pain? Got an answer for me? Why would you want the machine to feel pain? Ivan, why would you want the machine to feel pain? Yes. Yes, because you want that machine to take care of itself. You want it to have feelings. You want it to know when something bad has happened. You want it to protect itself. And if you can understand how pain is generated enough for that machine to help itself, you can even design that machine so that it feels the same pain when it hurts you. So there's another reason for wanting that, to understand at least how pain is produced. So that's why you would want a machine to understand pain. But still, I have to explain, to understand the problem. I want to separate out simulating pain from experiencing pain. You can go to the web and on YouTube find robots that appear to experience pain. These robots, they react to painful stimuli as if they had pain, but you know that they're not really feeling pain. So I'd like to explain what the problem is, that simulating and experiencing are really different. And one way to explain it is through a disorder called pain asymbolia. This is a very interesting disorder. Children are born with it. Who are born with it rarely live past the age of 3. It's a disorder where they know about pain. If you hit their thumb with a hammer, they know that it's painful. If you touch their finger in some location with something very cold, they know it's cold, they know how cold it is, they know where it is. If you prick them, all of this they know. They know about pain, but they don't suffer. It's okay. Young people who with this disorder giggle when you do something that another person would find painful, because they know about the pain, but they don't suffer it. And so the robots that we build are like pain asymbolic people. We can build them so that they know about the pain. We don't know how to build them so that they actually feel the pain, which is what I would like to get into here. So you understand what I'm going to try to do? What I'm trying to do is explain to you, for example, with pain, how does the machine act? How can you build that machine so it actually feels that pain? And I'm going to start with extreme pain. How can that conscious Turing machine generate the feeling of extreme pain? So the answer is, make the machine unable to do anything except concentrate on the pain. I'm talking about extreme pain now, and there's no reason for you to believe this except we really thought about it, and we've come to the conclusion that it has to do with the fact that when you have extreme pain, you cannot think about anything else. It's a terrible engineering design, because just when you actually need to think about what's going on to be able to get away from this, you can't do it. And in fact, this seems to be true. People in extreme pain, we've heard stories of people in extreme pain, kidney stones, terribly painful, and a person with kidney stones said he couldn't get on the telephone, he couldn't do anything. He was completely stopped, and only when somebody came in and saw what was going on could an ambulance be called. So, how is extreme pain generated? All attention on the pain, take away free choice. Under severe pain, can't do anything else. Any processor, any long-term memory processor that tries getting on the stage gets immediately pushed aside by the pain. It's interesting that William James, he's the psychologist who lived around the time of Freud, and a very wonderful psychologist, had this theory about pain, which said that basically you notice that you're sweating, you notice that you're trembling. These are the signs that you have pain and that is what's generating the emotion. We're saying it's not that. We're saying it's this loss of control. And the neuroscientists now are beginning to agree that it's the loss of control. So, but is loss of control enough? Does a machine feel real pain when it loses free will and is forced to pay attention to pain? Here's something that, let me switch to a different kind of pain. Let's look at the pain, the instant shock of pain. If you tear a ligament, it's very painful. There's this instant shock, a terrible pain, instant shock. People who've torn a ligament say sometimes that they will vomit right there. It's a horrible experience. How is that instant shock of pain generated? Well, you are aware of it, and that awareness is broadcast to every single processor. Basically, those processors are interrupted, whatever they are doing. So there is something like that. How does the conscious Turing machine generate the feeling of minor pain? And yes, so huge amounts of pain take away huge amounts of free will, and small amounts of pain take away small amounts of free will. And the confirmation is that under conditions that produce great pain, asymbolics, the people who don't suffer, they can think when they have severe pain. And I used to do this experiment. I wanted to get at what's causing the pain. So I tried to figure out how can I cause pain without damaging myself. Right? One way is you take an ice cold can of Coke. It should ice cold in the sense that there's to be ice and water together inside. This cannot do you damage. You will not get frostbite from ice cold can of Coke. You can hold it in your hand maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds max. An asymbolic can hold that can of Coke forever. It's okay. An asymbolic can play a game of chess with you and do a very good job, certainly beating me, because that asymbolic can think. I mentioned that asymbolic children don't live past the age of 3, but some people get hit on the head and become asymbolic, and then you can talk to them. One of the things that might come out of a theory like this is a good test for pain. We do not have a good test, but I can give you some idea of where that test might come from. The theory, after all, is saying that the more pain you have, the less you can think about anything else. So a possible test might be to figure out some way to get that person to get that person doing something that he likes to do, and basically see how well he can do it. The more pain that person has, the less able he will be. So that's an idea for a test. We want a test for pain that will tell how painful, how much pain the human has, and will be able to be used for a human that's trying to game the system. Because at least in my country, the people come to the doctor, they want some pills, they're in great pain, they want those pills, and then once they get them, they can go and sell them on the street. So we'd like to have a test that will actually tell us really how much pain the person has, and we like a test that would work also for robots. So we have, the suggestion would be to see how much other stuff they can do while they feel the pain. Hangxi Wang has another wonderful application. Do you have an iPhone in your pocket? The model, here's how this model compares to the iPhone in your pocket. When you want to do some particular computation, like look up something, you don't know if you should go to your phone book necessarily, or you should go to Google, or there are many locations in your iPhone that might have the information you want. If you want some computer to be doing something more like what we do, you would have all of those apps aware of what it is you want. and the one with the information should come up and give it to you. So this is what Hongxi Wang is doing. Open problems, suggested test for consciousness. That's suggested test for consciousness. Psychologists have a test for consciousness. It's kind of interesting. It's called the mirror test. The mirror test is you dab something on their forehead when they're not seeing, and then eventually you show them a mirror, and if they see it and then they try to get rid of it, that's a test of consciousness that the psychologists are happy with. And it's an interesting test because, first of all, it means that for example, this is done with elephants. Elephants are wonderful. You somehow manage to put a note on its forehead, and when it sees itself in the mirror, it will stop, and then it will raise its trunk and try to get rid of it. It's wonderful. It passes the test, the psychologist's test for consciousness, and this test is, what the test is doing that's really good is noticing that the elephant in this case is self-aware. It does recognize itself in the mirror. That elephant is capable of planning because it has to actually take that trunk and remove whatever it is on the forehead. And it's motivated to do that. It has the motivation. So it's got the three things that we require. It's an imperfect test. It's an imperfect test because, first of all, gorillas don't pass it. And why don't gorillas pass it? Because they, in order to see this, they have to look at the gorilla in their eye. And gorillas do not look at other gorillas in the eye. That's a no-no if you're a gorilla. So they are not even able to look. A bat doesn't recognize itself in a mirror because a bat doesn't use vision as much as it uses sound. We would like to have a good test for consciousness. Anyway, that's the end.